Hey, Scott and Chip, welcome to the Virtual CMO podcast. I'm so glad both of you could join us today.
Hey, Eric.
Hey,
Thank
Eric.
you for having us.
This is exciting. I was saying before the show started that this is the first time we've done two guests live. So you're going to give me some engineering challenges as we go through the show here, but that's great. I'm really excited to talk to you both, and especially about this new book that you wrote, Activate Brand Purpose. I was so captivated by the title of it. And what a time to write a book like this, right? We are in a new era. It seems like there's so much in the news every day about different movements that are going on. And I love the way that you've written a book that really talks about how brands can start to apply this. So as we get into this discussion today, first of all, I'd love it if you could briefly just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how this book came together. Scott, let's start with you.
Thank you, Eric. My name is Scott Goodson. I am the founder of StrawberryFrog, world's first movement marketing company. I've been doing this for about 20 some odd years. I started my career in Sweden back in the early 90s and helped a lot of Scandinavian companies define purpose. And then as we launched those companies outside of Scandinavia, in Europe and in Asia and even in the United States, we found that purpose strategies were too theoretical. So we started this idea of creating a movement, like a societal movement, as a way to engage people. So my background is that for the last 30 years. And then I've been working with Chip. He can introduce himself for over a decade. And we just thought this would be a great time during COVID, if COVID had a silver lining, to write this new book.
Hey, that's great. Chip, how about yourself?
Yeah. Chip Walker. As Scott said, we worked together for a number of years. I had strategy at StrawberryFrog and have for a little while, and have been doing this kind of work for at least a couple decades. About the book, we saw a hole in the marketplace in that there were tons of books out there that are about defining brand purpose. What is our why? You've probably seen a bunch of those.
Sure.
But what we did not see was a lot of books out there, or at least any good ones, that were about, well, what do you do with your brand purpose? How do you live it? How do you act on it? And the other thing I think is we saw over the past couple of years, particularly during COVID, was that clients were coming to us with that problem, saying we've developed a brand purpose, or we've developed more than one brand purposes. We've had consultants in, yet it just right now it's words on our website, it's a coffee mug, whatever. Help us figure out what to do with it. So that was kind of the onus for writing this book.
I'm curious, I mentioned at the top of the show, what an amazing time we're in for a book like this to come out. But I think that there's a general feeling that government is more or less broken, and that companies are having to step up and do things because of this perceived view that government is fairly ineffective at making big societal changes, making big societal investments. Do you really see that? Was that one of the things that drove you to write a book like this, is because brands are needing, in a way, to step up and fill a void?
So I think, look, the world is full of problems to be solved. I mean, the enormity of the problems is almost head-spinning. Each one of those problems represents an immense opportunity for businesses. Why focus on ideas the world doesn't need when there's good business in solving real problems? And whether you think the government is broken, or I tend to think that what government does is it's hard to visualize. So, for example, you go to a restaurant and you don't die because the government has legislation in place to ensure food is not going to kill you, or you get behind the wheel of a vehicle and people don't die. So there are certainly things the government is really quite good at. There are, of course, so many issues out there, and it's in the interest of corporations and companies and startups to solve those societal issues. As I mentioned, if there's better business in solving real problems than simply starting a business to make money.
I'm curious too, maybe just by way of definition, how do you really separate a movement from activism? What do you really define the two as?
Activism is an element of a movement, but it doesn't have to be. So movement is basically a framework Chip and I basically looked at this from a, let's say, a psychological perspective. What is it that motivates people to participate in, movement? And we've applied the principles of societal movements as a business tool for CEOs, HR, people directors, CHROs, chief strategy officers, even chief financial officers, as a tool to engage individuals, different types of stakeholders, whether they're employees. How do you galvanize 100,000 employees or a couple hundred employees? How do you engage prospects and consumers in the age of movement and cancel culture and activism? How do you introduce an IPO in today's world? Do you just use the old-fashioned equity model, or do you launch M shares? There's a lot of really interesting thinking in this new world. And not every movement has to be what I call a big M, social activist movement to drive, huge social change. You can drive elements of that, but it doesn't have to be, truly activist. But it's always great when there's a little element of activism in it, because ideally what we want to do is mobilize people.
Mm-hmm. You used a term in the book, I believe it was purpose washing. I've heard of greenwashing, when you talk about environmental issues. But do you think that that's a real problem today with companies standing behind or looking to stand behind an issue, but really there's nothing there? It doesn't go deep into the culture of the company?
Yeah. It's a huge issue. Sorry. And I think it's one of the things that's making the whole purpose dialogue out there, it's making a lot of people skeptical. So purpose washing to me is about, claiming some higher order role in the world that is not authentic to who you are. We see it all the time. Companies sort of jumping on the purpose bandwagon. I mean, we've seen it with Pepsi, Gillette, others, particularly taking up some sort of a social issue because it's kind of hot. They've never had any involvement with it in the past. It's unclear to see how it's connected to what they do or what they make. And so all of a sudden it starts to seem really, really self-serving. And thus the cynicism we see around higher purpose.
But I understand. I mean, I understand the CMO, the marketers out there, they hear a lot of talk around purpose, and that companies should have a purpose, a brand should have a purpose. They see brands like Dove, they see brands like SunTrust or other types of organizations that have really activated their purpose. And they sit there and say, we really need to bring purpose in, but it's really, really hard. It's like, how do you take this concept of purpose, which you can read about in like Why from Simon Sinek, once you,
right.
How do you find that purpose, which is a undertaking unto itself. But once you find that purpose, it's a bit like finding your belly button. Once you find with your belly, what do you do with it?
Right.
I think the question is really important, because toothless purpose is giving it all a bad name, isn't it? And I think purpose washing is one aspect, but so is having a purpose and not doing anything with it.
Yeah.
I'd love it if we could take an example of one company so that, people really get the idea of what you're talking about here, and then deconstruct it a little bit with your core sort of building blocks around this movement thinking. If you could we talk a little bit about Patgonia? Because I think that that's a brand that people recognize, and I think that their purpose, their DNA is pretty deeply embedded in that company culture, and you certainly made reference to it in the book. Can you talk about why that's a good example of a real purpose-driven company?
I think, and I'll let Chip talk to it. I just want to say, I think Patagonia is a great example, but it's not the right example for everyone.
Yeah.
And it's much more of an activist brand. And so I think, SunTrust is perhaps an example that most CMOs can wrap their head around. It's a large financial group. They developed a purpose called lighting the way to financial well-being. And then we stepped in to work with the leadership to activate that purpose. And what we did was we came up with a movement called On Up, which was a movement to help Americans move from financial stress to financial confidence.
Okay.
And they were able in the course of 5 years to generate over 6.5 million participants in this movement, and many other benefits, business growth and engagement, benefits both inside the organization and among customers and prospects. So that's a good example of what I would describe as a small M movement. There's a sense of activism, to drive this sort of positive change in society to help Americans, which is a real issue. A lot of Americans are financially devastated or financially illiterate. And this is a financial institution helping both corporations help their employees become financially literate as well as their customers. But I'll pass it to Chip to talk about Patgonia.
What I would just add to that's a mission that's very close to their line of business too. So it makes a lot of sense. It feels authentic that they would be doing that.
Absolutely. And that's a key, issue to overcome when it comes to activating, first of all, defining a purpose, but then activating it. And Chip has examples of really bad use of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, regarding Patgonia, I think Scott is right in that I think they're a little bit of an exception to the rule in that they are kind of a hardcore activist brand. I saw the CMO speak a year or so ago, a couple of years ago now, and she was pretty much like, that this is our belief. We're about saving the planet. We don't care who we piss off. If like it, then they don't need to be our customers, which is an admirable point of view, but it's obviously not everyone feels that way. Right. I think if you just kind of wanted an example of movement thinking, I think a related but maybe more relatable example would be a smart car. I don't know, the tiny smart cars that you see around the urban environments. Well, StrawberryFrog helped develop and position that. It was one of the first movements I think the company developed. And so it's a good illustration of movement thinking. So all movements start with kind of a grievance or dissatisfaction. What's going on out there in the world that needs to be made right? What is a problem that in society that we need to solve? Is there a change you want to see in the world? Is there an enemy that's standing in the way? And then there's a stand you're going to take to kind of overcome the enemy and achieve the change. But I think the shorthand that we do, which is easy to remember, especially for a situation like a podcast like this, is just sort of for and against. What is the brand against? What is the brand for? And in the case of Smart Car, the enemy was sort of stupidly over-consuming. Mm-hmm. Big, gigantic SUV in the urban landscape that's polluting things and taking up too much space. And what the brand was for was really just sort of a more conscious style of automotive consuming. So we called the enemy dumb, and we called the stand smart, and the movement became against dumb. And as we all probably know now, it was a big success, and Smart really took off. So that's just kind of an example of how movement thinking works. We could have sold Smart as being more energy efficient or making it more convenient so you can park, but none of those really connected with people the way that the movement did.
I'd love to drill down into those points a little bit more, because I know that the audience for this podcast tends to be a lot of small and mid-sized businesses. They're working on growing their marketing trajectory, trying to figure out how to be successful out in the marketplace. So if they're looking at this and saying, okay, I want to activate my brand purpose here, I really want to stand for something as a company, what are the steps that I need to consider? Because, we always hear about the big guys in the news, the Apples and whatnot, and all the things that they're doing for the environment or whatnot. But for some smaller businesses, they look at it and said, why I have such more limited reach. I'm such a smaller company. I don't have the recognition. So how can I do that? So I know that the first point in your building block is dissatisfaction. What do you mean by that?
I can take a swing at that, and Scott, by all means, jump in if I leave something out. But dissatisfaction is something going on in the world that's kind of a grievance for you, but not only for you as a company, but the people that you serve. What is a shared grievance? Every movement starts with a grievance. Think about, Black Lives Matter or Me Too or any of those. There's something that people thought, this is not right and it needs to change. And it was not only the organizers of the movement, it was the people that they wanted to reach. All believed that there was something going And to give you a small business example, we work and have in the book illustrated a company called Boll and Branch, and
Yes.
they make sort of luxury linens, and
Yep.
it started out as a startup. And they're sort of in the luxury linen business, but the founders sort of looked and saw that it was one of the most environmentally harmful processes of creating luxury linens that you could imagine. And of course, nobody who buys luxury linen thinks of that.
Sure.
And so that really became a grievance for them. Why do you have to destroy the planet just to get a really nice luxury linen experience? And what they really did was went in and focused on supply chain. That's really been their point of difference. And that is a very, very clean supply chain, and sort of redefining what luxury even means in linens. And that it feels great on when you sleep on these linens, but it's also a great experience from an environmental standpoint. So that's an example of how a small business was able to use movement thinking and kind of elevate itself above competition.
And I think, just to add to what Chip said, in Activate Brand Purpose in the book, we talk about this idea of movement thinking and how it changes behavior and minds. And it's been doing this obviously for generations. It's not in the last 5 years that movements have just risen out of the earth. I mean, movements have shaped human behavior for 10,000 years. But it is now the time for either startup founders or small business leaders to apply this to the core of their business to drive tangible change. And I think our economy and our world need it. And, the founders or the leaders of these companies will be rewarded. We've just, which I shouldn't say just, in 2019, we launched the Purpose Power Index, the first empirical study of purpose brands, first empirical measure of purpose brands in the US, which Chip led. And we had over 17,500 responses, and clearly and unequivocally, brands that are activating their purpose are thriving, especially during the last year and coming out of COVID. So it is a business strategy for growth, for transforming your organization, and whether you're a startup or you're a mid cap, it is a really valuable business strategy.
So if we take that then to the second point, which is the desired change aspect of the building block, if we look at that Boll and Branch example, so they wanted to have a cleaner supply chain, right? But is it just within their own organization, or do you view these changes having to affect, more than just the company's own supply chain, but really pushing that out and making it a cause that's outside the company as well?
Yeah, it's bigger. I mean, the supply chain was the executional way they brought about the change they wanted to see in the world. The change they wanted to see in the world was really the ability to have a great luxury linen without destroying the planet. Wouldn't the world be a better place if you, as a luxury buyer, didn't have to feel like you were, as I said, destroying the planet? The way they went about that executionally was through their supply chain. But the change you want to see is the change in the world. And I think one of the issues that we often see with people starting to do movement thinking is that, they'll think about the dissatisfaction and then the change they want to see in terms of their category. Like, the dissatisfaction is that my competition moves too fast. And the change I want to see is that we beat them in the marketplace. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the change in the world, in people's lives, and in culture and in society.
Because we want to connect emotionally with people. People are already feeling these ideas out there. We're not, a brand cannot create a movement. A company cannot create a movement. A company can identify and crystallize a movement that exists in our society. And the power of that, if you think about it, is millions of people are already feeling this, right? So in the case of SunTrust, millions of Americans already feel this economic stress. It doesn't matter whether you are unbankable or if you're a multimillionaire. During the last economic recession in the late 2000s, and then now coming out of COVID, a lot of people are feeling anxiety. And in that situation, we're not going to make something up and then
Sure.
put it out there. We're just taking what already exists, and that change is what the movement is all about. We want to help Americans move from financial stress to financial confidence.
Mm.
That's the change we want to see in the world. And the movement is designed around that. And it's not being made up. It's something that is real. We're helping the organization connect with customers, employees, and prospects. And by doing so, it's a much more engaging and more emotional way to participate in the world and with those different audiences.
We've talked a lot on this podcast about the power of storytelling and having a very compelling brand story to go along with your marketing messages. And I love that you're talking about that emotional connection here, because your third step in this process is really defining a nemesis. And when you talk about a nemesis, a villain, immediately an emotional connection sort of comes to mind just by using that word. So what do you really mean by a nemesis? Who's the nemesis in the SunTrust example?
Well, the nemesis, the way I like to think about it, there are different types of nemesis, and you can see how different movement leaders have cherry-picked a kind of, enemy out there, nemesis. The way I think about it is that classic Hollywood movie where the small village is bickering amongst themselves, and then Frankenstein comes rolling up, and everybody goes home and gets their pitchfork to keep the monster out.
Right.
It's, what is the nemesis that we are trying to, rally people around in order to defeat?
Mm.
That's the way I think psychologically you think about it. It's not the competition. We're not talking about our competitor in the market. In the case of SunTrust, the nemesis is financial stress. The enemy is anxiety. That incredibly, the pit of your stomach you feel at your son's high school graduation when you're worried about how you're going to afford to pay for college, instead of enjoying that moment. Sitting there and fretting, can't even look at your wife, can't look at your child because you're so anxious about the next 4 years. That is the enemy.
These are the pain points.
That's the pain point. Yeah. So we try to map out, those moments in human life where the enemy is ruining lives, negatively impacting people's lives. And we use that as a power source. We plug into that. We put our finger in that nerve, and that thing propels the movement into something more meaningful and relevant to a wide audience, because they can identify with that moment.
Yeah, I like that. So then once they've identified this, how do they go about taking a stand? What does that look like?
Well, that one's pretty simple. I mean, if the enemy is what you're against, the stand is what you're for.
Yeah.
And specifically, what is the stand you're going to take to kind of overcome this enemy, to sort of slay the dragon and achieve that important change that you've said you want to see in the world? And so, as Scott just said, in the case of SunTrust, if the enemy was financial stress, the stand was for helping make everyone financially confident. So, which is kind of the antithesis to stress.
Mm.
And when we launched that, we launched it with a number of different initiatives and activities, both inside and outside the organization. But when you launch that movement, you can lean into different aspects of that strategy. So sometimes you might want to lean into the nemesis in order for people to feel what we're fighting against. And other times you want to lean into what we're standing for. And you get to use those those pillars as really strong mechanisms for storytelling and emotional storytelling, but also logical, frameworks that people can say, "Oh, that makes sense. Yes, I see why that company's doing that. That does help me." And then underneath that, of course, you put your position, your portfolio of products, the services that you deliver. And, if you think about it from the context of how do I engage people, both our customers, our employees, as well as our prospects, then you see how this becomes a really powerful tool in the age of movements.
Mm. So you've gone through the process. Now you're taking a stand. Obviously, action follows. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is that, there are problems inside many companies where a lot of these things just end up as posters on the lunchroom wall, right? They're not really actionable. And I was surprised by the statistic. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but how many executives that you surveyed recognized that this could be impactful, but still aren't doing anything about it. How does this turn into action?
Yeah, well, I mean that's kind of the subject of the entire book is how you. So, but if I had to sum it up, by first and foremost, when you reframe something as lofty as a purpose, and as Scott was saying, in order to be inspiring, a purpose often has to kind of sound lofty.
Mm-hmm.
But when you reframe it in movement terms, just as we've been talking about, finding out what you're for, finding out what you're against in order to achieve this change you want to see in the world, all of a sudden it starts to become much easier to see what it is we need to do as a company and as an enterprise. So in the Boll and Branch example, when they identified the issues with destroying the planet via luxury, unfortunately, in the world of linens, it started to become very clear to them they needed to do something about their supply chain. Which you wouldn't think was as strategic. You would think that that's kind of something for the logistics department to worry about. But for them, it became very central to their entire proposition. But in the case of other folks like SunTrust, it became very clear if you want to give people financial confidence, you needed to help people get financial education. And that became a real cause for them, both inside their company, for their employees, but also for just regular retail customers of the bank. So it wasn't just about yakking and talking about stuff. It was actually doing something about financial education.
And I think, it can be really hard as a business leader in today's world. I mean, so many things are flying at you, and we've been through quite a challenging year. And coming out of this year, people inside your organization feel stressed. A lot of people are emotionally anxious. They don't know about the future. They may have health issues coming out of COVID. There's certainly many people that are worried about their finances. And there are issues around diversity and, the role of women. And women have felt the brunt of the pandemic the last year. There was an article, a podcast last week, in the New York Times podcast that interviewed mothers across the United States. Most of them had gone crazy. I mean, they're women who are leaders in business, who at the same time, and parents, have to deal with the kids. And many of them would have literally jumped. If they have another year of this, they would be jumping out of windows. And so there's so many issues. Of course, there's racial equality issues. And as a CEO of a company or a CMO or a marketer, you can't just stick a BLM sticker on your website and think you're doing well, or put a post up every year during Pride Week and think that, okay, that's fine, check, I did that. No, you need to have a purpose, and you need to think through all of these things so that you can have an appropriate response and hopefully a proactive approach that makes you relevant both to your employees, so they feel pride and confidence that you as a leader really know what you're doing and that you're a modern company whose best years are ahead. And also for the consumers, who we know from the Purpose Power Index that the study that Chip's done, consumers are buying products from companies who are activating their purpose. So take those two things into account. I think is really important.
Well, I had a guest on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and he represented an employee advocacy platform. So basically giving tools out to the employees to be able to reshare social media posts, automatically. And if I think back in the not too distant past, as an employee, you were often limited in what you could do to demonstrate maybe what your company's purpose was, right? Maybe you put a team together and you ran in the annual 5K charity run that they did downtown, or there was a donation drive that you participated in, or you cleaned up some litter on the side of the highway once a month. But there were sometimes limitations in what you could do. And now with some of the digital tools that are out there, you can spread the message of that brand much more easily if you get the employees to buy into it. I think a lot of them want to participate.
I mean, I would even go one step further. I would say that the peer-to-peer world is really dominant in how companies are, how employees are actually thinking about the company and what they do and the strategies, the CEO, the leadership. It's a completely flipped the pyramid. We tend to say, you can't demand compliance or even mandate change inside an organization, or if you're implementing a strategy, you can't mandate that in a company anymore. However, you can galvanize people by means of a movement where they feel you're fostering trust and you're allowing for creativity and participation. Think of it yourself. You're going to sit there and develop a purpose, and then you want that purpose to be genuine, take root, grow into a sturdy oak tree in the front yard of your building. How do you do that today? Do you just sit in your office, you, the CEO, with your CFO and your CMO, and write it up and launch it to rapturous applause? Or do you reach out to all your people and say, hey, help me build this. Help me do something here that's going to be meaningful, get their input, and then launch it, activate it with some program over a 3-4 year period, measure each type of activity. And some of them are digital. Some of them could be runs, as you said. Some of them are ambassador programs and so forth. And you will see a completely different organization, enthusiastic, people that are feeling like this company understands them and this company is where the world is going. It just makes sense. It doesn't be so complicated. But stopping at the beginning and saying, let's simplify all this down. Let's take our business strategy. Let's take our vision. Let's take our mission. Let's take our values. And let's try to simplify all this. And there's a new book by a professor from Harvard called Better, Simpler Strategy. I think simplifying all those things into something that people can do is the best way forward.
Scott, I think that's a great way to bring the conversation to a close. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. It's packed full of a lot of great examples, a lot of research. It's well cited. I'd highly encourage people to pick it up. Where can people go to find out more about both of you guys on the web, and where can they get a hold of a copy of this book?
Yeah, so the book has a website, so it's www.activatebrandpurpose.com. It's obviously available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all those kinds of platforms. But if they want to learn more about movement thinking and just sort of see how movements come to life in action, and I know this sounds self-serving, but there are a lot of good examples on our company website, which is StrawberryFrog.com.
And we didn't even get a chance to get into how Strawberry Frog came about. I'm sure that's an interesting story over a glass of wine sometime.
It was actually, it was when we set out 20 some odd years ago, we wanted a name that represented the challenger in the marketing and consulting space. So in that space, we have the large corporations, and Strawberry Frog really represents sort of the opposite of the sort of huge dinosaur. And the rarest frog in the world is actually a strawberry frog in the Amazon. So we thought that was our namesake, and therefore we called the company Strawberry Frog.
I love it. As I mentioned before, I'm a big fan of good brand stories. And if you've got a story to tell about the name of your brand, that's a conversation starter right there. Scott, Chip, thank you both for being on the show today. I really enjoyed it, enjoyed reading the book so much, and we'll make sure we have all of this linked up in the show notes so that people can find it.
Awesome. This was really great. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you both.